Hi everyone. It's great to be talking to you. It's great to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the state of the art in terms of research and clinical information that we have on maladaptive daydreaming. I wish to introduce to you today a psychological phenomenon that to my mind is gaining significant scientific and clinical interest, but still is quite unknown, and most professionals haven't heard about it, and the same goes for academic circles. There's one group, however, who is very familiar with it, and these are people who have been struggling with this problem. Some of you out there might be watching this video because you have a first-hand experience with this phenomena. At any rate, students, scholars, interested people, and consumers, you are all welcome. I have an ambitious outline today, but I might not have enough time to cover all the slides, but let's give it a try, because I think I've covered all that we know almost in this little field. So what is the essence of the phenomena I wish to introduce to you on this video? We will come back to this slide later on, but I thought it would be necessary to present it at the onset of my talk. I will attempt to differentiate maladaptive daydreaming from existing related, off-task, self-generated mental activities. But first, take a look at the features of this construct as we understand it. This is taken from the seminal paper from 2002 in which this term was first coined. So we're talking about a fantasy activity. So this is not like thinking about daily events or reminiscing. This is a fantasy activity that is volitional, so it's not a failure in attention, like mind wandering might be. It's a volitional act that involves scripting extensive, absorptive, very fanciful plots. And what is unique about this is there is some movement involved, kinesthesia. People who do this very frequently report pacing or rocking or shaking their hands. And an additional characteristic feature is listening to evocative music. Many people report that in order to trigger this form of fantasy, they require a certain kind of music to set the tone, and that the music is important to maintain the fantasy. Additionally, what is characteristic of this mental activity is that it is extremely rewarding. And many individuals coping with this report it as a sort of a compulsion or an addiction, because they have a need to repeat it because it's so fun, so much fun. But as in any addiction, that starts with fun, like recreational drugs or gambling, which is a behavioral addiction. Maladaptive daydreaming eventually creates distress. It can also interfere with the completion of daily chores, to include school or work, or even interacting with family and friends. People prefer to do that rather than attend to their other mundane daily activities. So let's move on now. Now that we defined the term, the pathological term, you may wonder, why am I pathologizing daydreaming? And indeed, daydreaming, it needs to be acknowledged, is a normal and very prevalent mental activity that most people engage in on a daily basis for brief periods of time. The term is used loosely to refer to a wide variety of mentations, including self-talk and thinking. So to add clarity, we need more precise definitions to differentiate between all these different mental activities. So let's take a look at daydreaming. Let's stay there. Singer and Klinger, these are prominent scholars in this field, regarded daydreaming as a childhood activity that is associated with play. It is creative, it is playful. And as I read the literature on maladaptive daydreaming, the nature of the daydreaming phenomenology often remains somewhat loosely defined. It's not quite clear what people mean when they refer to daydreaming. What is more clearly described is the function of daydreaming. So daydreaming research suggests that most of these self-generated mentations referring now to daydreaming, interact with the external experience. So I've emphasized in red on the slide, daydreaming has an adaptive role in the realm of plan preparation and rehearsal, emotional regulation, motivation, and learning from success and failure. People simply imagine future activity and rehearse them proactively, sometimes retroactively, to learn from mistakes and to understand experiences that they have gone through. So now let's shift our interest a little bit to a more extensive form of daydreaming, and many of you might have heard of the term fantasy-prone personality. This is the closest construct to maladaptive daydreaming, although it does not connote, when you look at the term, doesn't connote psychopathology necessarily. This construct, as I said, does have some overlap with daydreaming. However, the fantasy-prone personality is unique in that it has a measure as defined by the scholars who developed and coined this term, a measure that is called the Inventory of Childhood Imaginings, that assesses, among other things, assesses childhood events, rather than current experiences, because we want a measure that measures the mental activity. That is, in addition to a variety of mystical experiences that seem to have little face validity as far as daydreaming or maladaptive daydreaming are concerned, it also asks about childhood experiences. So the words that I colored in red on the slide that is presented to you stand for the distinctiveness of fantasy proneness and emphasize what sets it apart from maladaptive daydreaming. So let's look at the third bullet. These people tend to live in a world of imagery, imagination, and fantasy, hypnotizable, encouraged to fantasize as a child. They report mystical or paranormal experiences. They believe they have healing powers, and so on and so forth. So all of these properties and attributes are, to the best of my understanding, unrelated to maladaptive daydreaming. Still, what is noteworthy is that Rauschenberger and Lin assess that up to 6% of the population are fantasy prone. So the proclivity for excessive daydreaming as measured by their construct is definitely not rare. In fact, is a variation, perhaps, of normal daydreaming. Recently, however, there have been other constructs. By the way, we use fantasy pronouns as the criterion against which we developed and compared our measure of maladaptive daydreaming, because there was non-existent before, and no equivalent term. So we used that as our criterion to measure the construct validity. So, but let's look at mind wandering. It's a very popular and widely researched term. And unlike mind wandering, unlike daydreaming, I've alluded to this earlier, mind wandering is seen as the mind's idle mode. In this state, the mind is said to wander unintentionally. It wanders into remembering, into thinking and planning, and although normal, it is regarded by scholars in this field as an attentional failure. Something is not working right when one's mind wanders in terms of attention. And what sets it apart from maladaptive daydreaming is that it is not, mind wandering is not seen as a volitional act of internal focusing. Again, the contents of mind wandering is described as a dialogue with a person's external reality, and that is not necessarily the case, and often not the case, in maladaptive daydreaming. So what do we have here? Let's again look at the slide, what I've highlighted there. It's a ubiquitous psychological baseline from which people venture when attention is demanded. It's a motley of reflections and remembering and anticipation of future moments, seen as an attentional failure. And in terms of contents, it has it's related to autobiography or simulation of plausible alternatives. I'm putting this emphasis on plausible because, again, in maladaptive daydreaming, there could be fantasies associated with wishful thinking and so on. Some of these wishful thinking may have contents that could be attainable, but a lot of the daydreaming is often reported to be of fantastical nature. Another related term is the default mode network. And for those of you who are not from this field of brain studies, you would have to tolerate these technical terms, but this is another important term. Again, the default mode network is an area in the cortex, the outer layer of the brain, that lightens up during mind wandering. So these are the mechanisms, the brain mechanisms that are associated with interaction with reality in the mind. They address the person's past and future, but these mechanisms are not described as involving fanciful fantasy. So to put it more simply, the evidence regarding mind wandering might shed little light on the volitional, fanciful fantasy life of people with maladaptive daydreaming. And I think our challenge is, if we ever get to the stage of conducting brain imaging studies, is to show what areas of the brain light up when people are off task and mind wandering, and their default, and compared to people with maladaptive daydreaming. And more specifically, the question is, are people who are focusing intently on their inner world activating the default mode network, or perhaps other brain areas? Another clinical term that is associated with daydreaming is sluggish cognitive tempo. I don't like the term. It has a derogatory flavor to it, but this term is used to define a syndrome that is described as including two clusters of symptoms. First, being lost in thoughts or daydreaming, and so here is a potential overlap with fantasy proneness and mind wandering. And the other cluster of symptoms is physical and mental slowness and fatigue, a feature not present in daydreaming or in maladaptive daydreaming. In other words, although sluggish cognitive tempo may share some common features with the propensity for extensive daydreaming, it is described as a syndrome involving an overall slowdown, cognitive and also physical, a feature that does not appear in maladaptive daydreaming and therefore is distinct from it. Those of us interested in maladaptive daydreaming and who have talked with individuals who cope with this mental activity know that the origins of this disorder or this construct is rooted in childhood. And most people, I mean, it is very rare. In fact, I don't remember if I even met one person who reported that maladaptive daydreaming erupted de novo during adulthood. So what are the childhood origins or antecedents of maladaptive daydreaming? Well, the answer to that might have been hiding in plain sight. Stereotypical movement disorder is a DSM, a psychoneurological disorder that is in the DSM associated with, first observed typically in childhood. And and again, I must say that I've been in touch with individuals who are studying stereotypical movement disorder. There's a group in Canada, there's a group in the United Kingdom, and these experts suggest that among children with this neurological, psychoneurological problem, there's a subgroup of children that display a unique pattern of behaviors that include not only the stereotypical movements, but also daydreaming. They report that a lot is going on in the mind, with contents taken often from cartoons or children's stories. And also noteworthy is the fact that the children are reported to enjoy this mental activity, indicating, again, its rewarding characteristics and the potential for habit formation. The next slide, I'm not sure, it involves a little video, but because of technical reasons, I'm not going to show it now. But what you see is there's an open door there. And by the way, this is public domain, uploaded on YouTube, and there are many, many such testimonies, both of adults talking about their own experiences and also parents filming their own children and asking in this social media for comments and advice. So in this video, there's a girl filmed by her mother who is on the bed. You can see a dog lying on the bed. And the child moves back and forth with a dual awareness. She is obviously immersed in her own fantasy, moving her head and sort of oblivious to what's going on and to her mother, but she doesn't bump into the furniture as she walks back and forth. She purposely then, at the end of this brief video, sits on the sofa, you see it sort of backed up to the wall there, and moves a curl of hair that seems to stimulate her face. So although she seems lost in her world, she's not entirely lost, she's not entirely oblivious to sensations emanating from her body. and certainly not entirely oblivious to the surrounding, because she is walking on a particular path with success, without bumping into furniture. So yeah, okay, it does move. She holds an object in her hand, and is talking to herself, gesturing, I guess, appropriately to what is going on in her mind. Okay, so this subgroup of children with stereotypical movement disorder have been identified by a group of scientist practitioners in London who have recently coined the term and added to this already complicated nomenclature the term intense imagery movements. So again, apparently an identical syndrome to stereotypical movement disorder, but note that in the title of the construct, the emphasis now is more on the imagery or the fantasy rather than the movements. And again, these clinicians, scientists, practitioners indicate that IIM seem to interfere with daily functioning and the well-being of these children. So let's go back to the definition that I've started with. So we are talking again about something different and undescribed before. Perhaps an adult version of IIM, or stereotypical movement disorder, with this specific component of fantasy. By the way, I'm also aware of one or two studies coming from Canada on stereotypic movement disorder, reporting a subgroup of children who enjoy their fantasy and reported that this is what they're doing. Let's review now a brief history of this construct. Again, this 2002 paper, how was it born? I am a scientist practitioner myself. I specialize in trauma-related and dissociative disorders, and my initial observations of maladaptive daydreaming were made in my trauma practice. So, as you would expect, the patients who displayed maladaptive daydreaming, whom I first met, reported a significant trauma history. And in the next slide, marked in, in blue, you see the history of these 6 patients, the first reported in this extended case study in 2002. They all had moderate to severe childhood adversities. So this led me to believe that somehow this is another form of a dissociative disorder, beginning at first perhaps as a defense mechanism against intolerable reality and inescapable reality, by forming an alternative reality in which the child has better control and perhaps forms better attachments. All right, so this 2002 paper seemed to have very little impact on the scientific community, or so it seemed to me throughout these years. However, individuals struggling with this mental behavior did what millennials and young adults do today. They search the internet for information. And many have found the paper online, and the term that has been adopted by the maladaptive daydreaming community has really gone viral. So it's a term that has not existed prior to 2002. And what you can see here is an immense consumer interest. The exact term maladaptive daydreaming in Google yields over 200,000 results. What does it mean? This means that there is a need out there. There's a great interest out there, not by scholars, I believe, but by consumers. And indeed, what ensued later is a growing consumer pressure on me and others who have collaborated with me to contribute further knowledge on this field. We described this in this paper that is open access and available online. And I must admit that I continued to I was on a track of clinical work and research on trauma and dissociation, but this ongoing pressure that I will show you some examples of, particularly reflected in emails sent to me almost on a daily basis from all corners of the world. This pressure contributed to my own motivation to resume the maladaptive daydreaming research. And so from 0 mentions in the web in 2001, here we are at over 200,000 results. You can also see this when the change in public interest in maladaptive daydreaming over time by looking at Google Trends. And here I entered fantasizing and mind-wandering. Fantasizing is the more lay term. Mind-wandering is the existing, I guess, competing term, and maladaptive daydreaming. And as you can see, maladaptive daydreaming is pretty flat there on the bottom still in 2007, with fantasizing and mind-wandering showing stable interest over time until today. But what happens to maladaptive daydreaming, these incredible peaks and surge of interests. And the concomitant outcome of this was and still is the mushrooming of consumer activity on the web. It's really signaled the need to be heard and to be helped. So internet communities were created in many languages and continents. And since maladaptive daydreaming was and still is an unrecognized clinical syndrome, consumers needed help, and those who needed help and also were computer savvy went up for help and sought help among internet communities. So they created their own environment in which they could talk, describe, and be supported without being dismissed or ridiculed. Facebook groups were established, again, in many languages. Listservs and other support groups online were formed. And if you look carefully, the Yahoo group consists, when this screenshot was taken, over 3,300 members, and this other group 1,400 members, and so on and so forth. And there are numerous of such groups. YouTube testimonies were uploaded and people talking with a face shown. They really are courageous, and I think their work is important because YouTube is also social media, and this generates discussions and a sort of a maladaptive daydreaming Me Too type of phenomena that it minimally gives people the sense that they are not alone out there, and people share ideas and thoughts on how to regulate their daydreaming. Again, these testimonials, I'm not violating any privacy issues here, because these testimonials are free, open domains, free domains available on YouTube for anybody interested, or for study and analysis. As I found out later, this phenomena was also characterized by an inundation of emails. I mean, these are a sample, with identities disguised. Again, for years, not a week goes by without my receiving multiple inquiries and requests for information for consumers, and that's healthy, but again, showed me a need and motivated me even further to do my best to contribute to knowledge and recognition of maladaptive daydreaming. In the meantime, my ResearchGate copy of the original 2002 paper was read over 2,000 times and was cited 29 times. I'm not sure, I don't think I've read all the papers who have cited it, but I'm sure not all of them deal with maladaptive daydreaming. In fact, I know that, many of the papers are just citing this as a possibility of daydreaming that can go awry. But what I later found out that indeed I was not alone, and apparently, unbeknownst to me, other scholars started showing interest in this phenomena. For example, the case study on the right reported a successful treatment with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. This was an individual with maladaptive daydreaming with no reported history of child abuse, whose psychiatrist believed that might meet criteria for an OCD spectrum disorder, and conceptualized maladaptive daydreaming as a form of OCD, and prescribed medication commonly prescribed for OCD. Again, the patient is free of symptoms since then. The paper on the left was the first paper to analyze responses of a fairly larger amount of individuals, 90 self-diagnosed individuals who responded to a call for participation posted on select online communities. So I later on contacted these authors and we've collaborated. Let me see. Yeah, this is the slide I wanted to show you. What you see here is an incredible interest by the media in maladaptive daydreaming. This is taken from a website that we are maintaining on the topic. And as you can see, BBC, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal are only among many important media outlets who have contacted me and others to develop stories on this. Why would these important media outlets be so interested in this rather esoteric or obscure mental condition? I'm not sure, but perhaps the novelty of it, in combination with the pertinence of dissociative disorder to a wide audience, explains some of this media attention, and maybe even some of the editors or reporters were familiar with someone who had this. The media coverage included primetime human interest stories in some leading TV outlets. Huffington Post Live, CBS News, CNN, BBC World News are among those who featured this story. But again, if you want to look at these stories, we've uploaded them, and this is the web address. If you Google daydreaming research, I'm sure you will find our website. We have talked to over 2,000 individuals from all corners of the world, individuals who self-diagnosed themselves as having maladaptive daydreaming. They volunteer to take part in qualitative and quantitative research. The next slide I'm going to show very briefly shows split screens of me interviewing these individuals. And again, when the science of a certain phenomena as it is at its infancy, it's important to gather information when you don't have hypotheses yet from the consumers, from those experts by experience who could tell you what is it like. And we learned a lot from these individuals. Still, the field is in its infancy. However, despite that, scientific interest is gaining momentum, and we have published several good papers in peer-reviewed journals, and more are coming. There's several in press, several submitted, and several studies are now in progress. Hot off the press, here is a study published this week. No, it was, I would say, this month, but by the time you see it, it might be old already. It provides evidence about the relevance of maladaptive daydreaming in a non-English speaking culture, and it highlights the potential value of this assessment tool, the maladaptive daydreaming scale, for worldwide investigation of this condition. So you might know that there is such a scale, such an instrument, the 16-item maladaptive daydreaming scale. You know, in the future we may be able to find out that perhaps we don't need as many as 16 items. But I'm happy to say that our research is based on a solid measure. We have other measures like the maladaptive daydreaming scale, and it demonstrated good validity, good consistency, internal and temporal stability, and this scale discriminated well between self-identified individuals with and without maladaptive daydreaming. So considering the instrument's high sensitivity, it can really detect well those who have maladaptive daydreaming, and specificity, meaning that they don't include or wrongly identify people who don't have it as having the disorder. Giving all these properties that we've demonstrated, it seems like an excellent measure to study maladaptive daydreaming. Look, we have 26 translations of the instrument. This is because, again, of the consumers volunteering to do translation. Some of the consumers, people who are coping with maladaptive daydreaming, know individuals who have maladaptive daydreaming. Many of them were mental health professionals themselves, some struggling with this problem. So many of these translations are really high quality versions of the instrument, and currently it's being translated into Vietnamese and into India's main languages, Hindi and Marathi. So again, it's a grassroots effort, and it's the consumers out there who are to be thanked for it. And you know, contrary to criticism sometimes of psychology and psychiatry that it tends to over-pathologize normal behaviors, here we have a different trend. We have not, you know, the individuals out there being victimized by this establishment of psychiatry, but rather them reaching out, a grassroots effort to have their suffering be acknowledged, studied, so they could have some recourse eventually. We recently performed, and we are still analyzing, an exploratory network analysis on the items of the maladaptive daydreaming scale. The items are marked by numbers, and blue lines indicate positive relationships and red lines indicate negative relationships, and the strength of the association is indicated by the thickness of the lines connecting the items. So this kind of analysis aims at identifying the item clusters in the data, and what this analysis that we haven't published yet tells us is that the construct of maladaptive daydreaming has three solid components: the unique physical sensory feature of the movement, plus the importance of exposure to music. This is one cluster. The rewarding or addictive property of maladaptive daydreaming is another cluster. You can see it visually. And the impairment it causes is the third cluster. We also developed a DSM-style diagnostic criteria for future nosology of daydreaming disorder. DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders of the American Psychiatric Association. And here you have, you know, the suggested diagnostic criteria. We tested them. It will be too technical to go through them. They are all online on our website. And we also developed an interview, like the SCID, the Structured Clinical Interview for the DSM. So we developed a SCID-style interview for maladaptive daydreaming, and the data are very encouraging. We had 2 clinicians blind to the diagnosis of those referred to them for assessment, applying the structured clinical interview for maladaptive daydreaming, and the degree of inter-rater agreement was very high compared to other DSM disorders. So we're pleased with that. As I told you, we've gathered a lot of qualitative data on maladaptive daydreaming. They are important, as I said, in the early stages, in the early exploration of a new construct, because they provide rich information from the experts, the consumers, on the essence of the experience in question. So actually we collected we collected the data that I'm showing to you and in other slides before we conducted the quantitative research presented so far. But because of time limitations, I will not be able to present all the qualitative data in this video lecture. But those who wish to appreciate the full richness of our respondents' description, you could go to our website again and download the papers. Please note that some of the features later captured by the maladaptive daydreaming scale network analysis I showed you a moment ago were indeed first reported by the consumers during our in-depth interview. So these are the main features that our qualitative data revealed. And the question that I've asked myself, being a dissociation scholar and clinician, maladaptive daydreaming is essentially about absorption, internal absorption. And absorption is a subscale, a subconstruct of dissociation, considered, by the way, by my colleagues as a normal form of dissociation. So I asked myself, to what extent is maladaptive daydreaming dissociative? And we have some data to indicate that it definitely is a form of dissociation. It definitely is about absorption, but it is an abnormal form of absorption. And here are some of the evidence that show the similarity of, in terms of the origins, the development of maladaptive daydreaming, the similarity to other more severe dissociative disorders. So distancing from painful childhood adversities is something that we heard. Not everyone has had childhood adversities to report, but here are some examples. I grew up with some physical but mostly emotional abusive people. I was always a scapegoat. There were fights between the parents and they would blame their problems on me, screaming on the top of their lungs at me for hours and hours every night. One way of coping seemed to have been the creation of an alternative reality capable of providing these children a soothing and a virtual experience of safety and love that they have missed in their real lives. So I believe that in some cases, dissociative disorder develop under similar circumstances, and a capacity to dissociate or to be absorbed in daydreaming interacts with the trauma, and the resulting relief increases the likelihood of repeat and it intensifies the utilization of this coping mechanism. So here is how one respondent described the rewarding properties of creating an alternative reality. This is the second quote: "I would daydream about family, mainly a brother and a sister about 17 years of age, very beautiful and successful, and they were each other's best friends and felt deep love for each other, something I never had in reality." Again, and beneath the quotes you have the sources. They are online on our website. You can download them. Another pathway to the development of maladaptive daydreaming is probably associated with the fact that some individuals learn to satisfy their unmet childhood psychological needs through their fantasies. So they achieve the emotional sustenance from their daydreaming, that again, because it's so real. So again, let's look at the second quote. "I hated every aspect of my life and needed to get as far away from that as possible. As a teenager, I started daydreaming about my life. I imagined myself having a different life." And again, if we look at this recent post that I received, it describes all these features of the need for the daydreaming, but also the maladaptation that it causes eventually, despite its obvious benefits. So this message addresses a Facebook group administrator and the group members. Let's go back to the question of to what extent is it dissociative. Maladaptive daydreaming it also provides with compensatory experiences. They are necessary for the healing of the soul and of the damaged self-image. Most of the time my daydreams have a good ending for me. Often I become rich. I'll dream that I'm getting some power, like a payback to everybody who told me that I would be an unsuccessful person. I stand tall and I say, I did it. I got what I wanted in life. Mom should be proud. But we also have statistical evidence that confirms that maladaptive daydreaming is associated with dissociative experiences. Here you have a correlation matrix between the maladaptive daydreaming scale and the dissociative experiences scale, the DS. And what is noteworthy is the intensity of the relationship with absorption, previously considered to be the least pathological experience of dissociation. So our data showed that absorption can be psychopathological, and that maladaptive daydreaming is closely related to dissociative absorption experiences, as measured by this most widely used dissociative measure, the DS. And what is noteworthy for those of you who are statistically savvy is that the effect size is extremely high for the correlation between MDS and the absorption subscale of the DS. The relationship between chronic childhood trauma and dissociative psychopathology is very well documented. We recently also showed that maladaptive daydreaming plays an important role in this relationship as a mediator. We also noted that when we looked at a particular form of childhood adversities, maladaptive daydreaming showed a significant relationship only to emotional neglect. So neglected children, abused children, those who are sexually exploited or physically abused, must pay attention to the threats out there. So their focus naturally would not be inward, but as they're being abused or getting ready for the traumatic experiences, the repeated traumatic experiences, they must monitor their behavior to minimize getting hurt. So they focus outwardly. In the psychological neglect, there's nothing much happening, particularly not much of what is needed is happening. So it makes sense that individuals who are neglected would tend to soothe themselves in their imagination. But more specifically, the mediation role is even more evident when we look at the role of maladaptive daydreaming in the relationship between childhood neglect and dissociation, as I said. And why is that? I have just explained, but the slide shows that you see the bottom left, emotional neglect, shows even a stronger relationship and a stronger role as a mediator between, maladaptive daydreaming, that is plays an important role there when emotional neglect is the source of the distress. This is not to say that maladaptive daydreaming does not interact with more aggressive form of childhood abuse, of course, and we have evidence that the rates of this mental activity is high among survivors of childhood sexual abuse compared to controls. So this is a suggested etiological model of how this develops. We believe that maladaptive daydreaming is based on an innate capacity. The capacity itself is not pathological, is not a disorder. Rather, it could be seen as a talent or a gift. And could be enjoyed when used in moderation, like gambling, like drinking, like any type of addiction. So I believe that something needs to happen, and what is usually happening, we have this discovery of this inner world. It is extremely rewarding, so the tendency is to repeat it, but when the external reality is painful, inescapable, intolerable, the motivation to engage in this highly accessible form of creating an alternative inner world is ever more rewarding. But we do need to coin another term for this non-pathological form of intense, immersive, absorptive daydreaming that I call the trait. The trait itself, again, is not abnormal. And I have a young colleague from Australia, Melina West, and she suggested the term immersive daydreaming to describe this capacity. So immersive daydreamings are not only different from irregular daydreaming, it also differentiates, it's also different from maladaptive daydreaming. I mean, I'm talking about the immersive daydreaming. There are maladaptive daydreamers are experiencing more difficulties in emotional regulation than the other groups, but they also tend to be more empathic and they have fewer creative outputs. You can see that when you look at these are three groups: non-MD, immersive daydreamers, and maladaptive daydreamers. You see that in terms of creativity, they are less creative. But again, this measure gauged the creative output, not the mental activity. So apparently being engaged extensively in daydreaming is at the expense of materializing the good ideas that come into mind when one daydreams. So the ability to translate the creativity into action is compromised when all one does is, to use a term I've heard from people I've interviewed, waste their life away in daydreaming. That does not, it is not commensurate with being present and implementing the ideas. So like dissociative disorders, maladaptive daydreaming produces only a limited sense of relief and actually can be detrimental to mental health on the long run. So here's some evidence about the unhelpful impact of maladaptive daydreaming on survivors of childhood sexual abuse. They score higher on maladaptive daydreaming, and survivors of childhood sexual abuse with probable maladaptive daydreaming, we have a cutoff score that can identify people who are suspected for having maladaptive daydreaming. They scored higher on social phobia, on social isolation, depression, anxiety, stress symptoms, compared to survivors without suspected maladaptive daydreaming. So that all of that together implies that maladaptive daydreaming exacerbates, on the long run, exacerbates psychosocial problems linked with childhood sexual abuse. What is important to say that some of the sources of distress are not necessarily historical and not rooted in childhood, but because of the chain effect, a lot of the problems are experienced in the present. Many maladaptive daydreamers have numerous other current problems, suggesting, as our model implies, that the capacity for inner soothing can be helpful, at least in the short run, by mitigating concurrent problems such as social anxiety. But socially anxious maladaptive daydreamers who fantasize social success by overdoing this kind of mental activity, actually contribute to their social isolation, and that creates further distress that, like in any addiction model, motivates the individuals to calm themselves down with more daydreaming. So we're talking about a painful present that requires some emotional regulation. That could also be related to maladaptive daydreaming's comorbidity with other psychiatric disorders. And indeed, in a recent study, we found that this is indeed an issue. But let me say that comorbidity is common in many, if not all, DSM disorders. For example, disruptive mood regulation, it's a DSM disorder. It occurred with another disorder, depending on the study, 62% to 92% of the time. So maladaptive daydreaming, like other DSM disorders, is highly comorbid. 77% comorbidity with attention deficit disorder, the inattentive type. A 71% comorbidity with anxiety disorders, a 67% comorbidity with depressive disorders, and a 54% comorbidity with OCD spectrum disorders. So clearly, for those who are still skeptical about maladaptive daydreaming being a pathological form of daydreaming, this kind of evidence I think is quite convincing with regard to the abnormality of this condition. Still, childhood trauma is reported only by 27% of people with maladaptive daydreaming, and not reported, conversely, by 73%. So for those listening to and watching this instructional video who are interested in dissociative identity disorder, I would suggest that the ability to fantasize effectively that the trauma is not happening to me, but to her, quote unquote, requires a capacity to create an alternative internal reality that could share similar mental mechanisms with maladaptive daydreaming. I see a great similarity there, etiologically. As one colleague who probably will be watching this lecture said, she brazenly suggested that DAD could be a subtype of maladaptive daydreaming. At any rate, trauma is not a necessary condition for maladaptive daydreaming. So is it sort of an addictive disorder? People who have the trait for immersive fantasy simply like it. It's a built-in virtual reality, highly accessible, legal. And they like it so much that they want to spend more time immersed in it, and they prefer this activity to the more boring chores of daily life. It's comforting, enjoyable pastime. It would be upsetting for me if I couldn't access it. I prefer daydreaming because my life is boring, and so on and so forth. At any rate, when we consider treatment goals, we must bear in mind that our goal is not to abolish it completely, like the use of heroin. We don't want to use heroin recreationally. But here we're talking about a normal behavior, ubiquitous, highly prevalent, in this case also very intense in terms of the vividness and sense of presence it creates. But we don't want to turn it into zero. We want to help people, and that's what we're trying to develop, attain better regulating mechanisms so they could tune in and out into this mental ability at will, but also in a controlled manner that will allow them to lead a successful life. So the phrasing of the description of maladaptive daydreaming as an addiction is out there. It's used by the consumers themselves. Some of them have created websites to address this issue and regard it as an addiction. It could also be construed as an OCD spectrum disorder. So many maladaptive daydreamers describe a need to repeat their fantasy. Some explain it as a need to perfect it. It's not quite right, so they repeat it over and over again. And in a recent longitudinal study, with daily measures, we found that obsessive-compulsive symptoms were the only consistent temporal antecedent of maladaptive daydreaming. It came before, so it closely related. OCD, to remind you, was also implicated in the only medication study on maladaptive daydreaming. I talked about it earlier. So the question at hand is the ontological quandary. What is maladaptive daydreaming and what is it probably not? How is it related to sluggish cognitive tempo? Well, to put it in short, unlike sluggish cognitive tempo, maladaptive daydreaming does not involve any lethargy, mental or physical. So there's some overlap, but it's definitely not that. How is it related to mind wandering? Well, mind wandering has been shown that it's associated with increased fidgeting. So we have that slight kinesthetic component. But by contrast, the interest, attention, and visual engagement lead to non-instrumental movement inhibition. So maladaptive daydreaming is characterized in contrast by interest, attention, and internal visual engagement, and is associated with purposeful stereotypical movement, and is not task negative. This is the task. The fantasy is the task. So here is a recent email I received. I also experienced the craving and the compulsion. However, I find that maladaptive daydreaming requires a huge amount of mental energy, which I don't have. As I feel a compulsion to daydreaming, I feel that I am missing the fuel for it. So it's an effort. It requires a purposeful effort. So it's not a resting phase of the brain, and it's, to my mind, probably not mind wandering. And default mode network is, again, the brain mechanisms that fire up, light up during mind wandering. It has been shown to be negatively correlated with other networks in the brain, such as attention networks. And maladaptive daydreaming requires active, purposeful mental activity, so I would be surprised if the default mode network is activated during maladaptive daydreaming. And so here we have the question of, is it a later and adult form of stereotypical movement disorder or intense imagery movement? So could intense imagery movement be one etiological pathway leading to maladaptive daydreaming? Is this a precursor to maladaptive? We don't know the answers to that yet, and only future research will shed light on it. But the questions have been addressed already. Roger Freeman in Canada, and again, Sally Robinson and her team in London, UK, with Tammy Hedderly as the director of that unit. So what is it? Again, this is cutting-edge science. We are on an exploratory phase still. Science in its infancy. Is it a stress-related disorder? Is it a dissociative disorder? Is it a behavioral addiction? Is it an OCD spectrum disorder? Is it an attention deficit disorder? Remember, we had a 77% comorbidity with ADHD inattentive type. Or perhaps a combination of the above. We still don't know. So you, the viewers, might have different and many more research questions, but here's a suggested start for an interdisciplinary scientific dialogue, with scientists who might be watching this. In the meantime, as a scientist practitioner, I have moved on to develop a preliminary treatment model based on what we know thus far about maladaptive daydreaming. I described it in a case study published in a new clinical journal of my international society, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. And this particular treatment consisted of modes that were tailored to suit the needs of the client. First of all, we had motivational interviewing. It's an important component in the treatment of addiction and the support of abstinence because it addresses the motivation that is so badly needed in the battle against the craving for the rewards associated with addictive behavior. So that was an important component. We also used CBT elements. It is important to understand the patterns of maladaptive daydreaming, the timeline circumstances that lead to this behavior. So alternative activities that are incompatible with daydreaming could be employed. The waste of time that this particular client was concerned about was counteracted with careful daily activity planning and also reinforcing the positive outcome, and also negatively, not negatively reinforcing, but internally punishing by creating unfavorable outcome to the fantasy, so they will not be as rewarding. So there are some CBT principles we used. Also self-reinforcement for successes, accountability was introduced. The patient was encouraged to text me and the outcome of his efforts and keeping daily records, employing coping statements. And also mindfulness training. Mindfulness training was, to this patient, the most effective treatment module. It is a logical antidote to daydreaming, as it is an anchoring mental activity that redirects the mental focus from internal absorption to mindful awareness of the external reality. So in this particular patient, in his case, he also was concerned about compulsive internet use, described in blue. And he added the reduction of internet use as an important secondary goal. Note that the complete elimination of daydreaming is not a reasonable goal we aimed at, and neither is the complete elimination of internet use a reasonable goal to achieve. But as you can see visually, the patients seem to have gained from this treatment, and a lot of the gains were still maintained at follow-up. Here is the result from a self-report of problems in daily functioning, indicating again a stable improvement in daily functioning. That's what's so important. I mean, a person can fantasize all that he or she wants, but as long as they don't suffer and continue to meet their daily obligations and self-expectations. These are the scores of the maladaptive daydreaming scale. They indicate a post-treatment reduction followed by a small rebound, probably indicating the craving for maladaptive, for daydreaming that increased the distress. I remember this is what he was reporting, which suggests to me that this might be might meet the definitions of an addiction. What is shown here is support for the idea that the intervention suppressed the maladaptive daydreaming behavior, but not the craving. This is demonstrated in this chart. The client this chart measures the pleasure derived from this absorptive form of daydreaming, and what the figure shows that this client is clearly at risk for relapse, because at the end of treatment and at follow-up, he continued to report intense pleasure derived from his immersive daydreaming. Okay, we also submitted a paper that I hope and I'm very confident will be published, showing the artistic expression of maladaptive daydreaming and how it represents itself in the drawing. For example, this picture represents a recurrent maladaptive daydreaming theme, probably of compensatory nature. The person here is at the center of attention, speaking or lecturing in front of a crowd. This is a recurrent theme of her own daydreaming, and probably in contrast to her otherwise socially avoidant nature. This artistic expression of maladaptive daydreaming, in this picture you see the respondent describing how he feels weighed down by his large wobbly head that leans in the opposite direction of his destination. He wants to move forward, his hands are extended forward, and his desired destination includes, as he has written there on these boxes or books, goals, success, relationships, etc., all the hallmarks of good functioning, but he seems to be way down in the opposite direction. This is a humoristic representation of maladaptive daydreaming experienced as an internal entertainment system. While other people require electricity to power their entertainment system, this person can be happily amused while the cord to external power is unplugged. In this representation of maladaptive daydreaming experience, the respondent cuts his or her ties with society, with the scissors, and all the values society represents. I also notice that the person feels criticized by society for his or her maladaptive daydreaming. And also please note that while society is depicted in gray, monochrome, the maladaptive daydreaming world, including the person herself, is colorful and rich. Here is a similar pictorial element. Here is a self-representation of the person in her bed, immersed in a daydreaming bubble, listening to music and surrounded by colorful spheres. That's her daydreaming world. Outside the colorful bubble is a gray world with signifiers of the passing time, social life, basic needs, hobbies, all locked out and ignored. Here is a depiction of a dreamy character immersed in her colorful fantasy world where rabbits do not cease from jumping out of the hat. Perhaps it's a representation of the loss of control over the magic of immersive daydreaming. And finally, a wonderful illustration of the gap between fantasy world and the gray monochrome reality. This is again a recurrent theme in the artwork of Maladaptive Daydreamers that conveys the dramatic contrast between the rich, vivid, colorful world of fantasy and the grayish reality. And also note that the daydreamer is involved in movement, she's not still, and seems quite happy. So here's a list of what we know thus far. I will not repeat it, but we are accumulating knowledge. We are continuing to study this, and I'm sure that within 1 year of the making of this video, this will be obsolete because we would have known, we would know much more. Still, open questions remain. You know, these are the frontiers of our knowledge. We need more scientists, more practitioners to join our efforts of generating and disseminating knowledge. We need the continued support of the maladaptive daydreaming community. They've been wonderful in volunteering themselves to take part in our study. But again, most of all, we need more scholars, more academics to join the study, the effort of research in this field. Please visit our website to learn more about maladaptive daydreaming and join us either as consumers or researchers. You can, if you want to receive updates, you can register online. So for October 2018, that is the latest update on the state of the art of the knowledge on maladaptive daydreaming. So stay tuned. Bye-bye.